People say that being an athlete isn't a normal profession for a reason. If you reach the pinnacle of your sport, you will have no shortage of cash in the bank or supermodels in your DMs. Professional sports superstars reap rewards that the average person can only dream of at their 9-to-5 office job. However, it is a depreciating skill set to master. Sooner than later, Father Time is going to steal your physical strength in exchange for back pain. Professional athlete is the most washed up career path one can possibly choose. Even the all-time greats that climb the top of that mountain tend to become a shell of their former glory. Think Shaquille O'Neal playing center for the Boston Celtics, or Albert Pujols as the first baseman for the Los Angeles Angels. Now NASCAR has Jimmie Johnson driving for the Legacy Motor Club. In his 7 starts as a driver for his own team, the 7-time champion doesn't even have a top 25 finish. This even as his schedule included a return trip to Dover. There was a time where Jimmie Johnson made Miles the Monster look as intimidating as Cookie Monster. Now that same driver is getting outdriven in the same equipment by a driver making his first Cup start with a substitute crew chief. To make things even more puzzling, Jimmie Johnson's loop data stats are more comparable to a Harrison Burton or Daniel Hemrick rather than a Kyle Larson or William Byron. Jimmie Johnson is becoming old and broken down. Give it a few more years and women will be crying in public every time they see old 7-time out alone. It is clear that Jimmie Johnson is struggling to adapt to modern NASCAR. So, the first step to understand Jimmie Johnson's struggles as a driver is to understand his style. Jimmie Johnson likes to drive off the right rear. Basically, he likes a loose race car. This is what made Jimmie Johnson so successful back in the day. Chad Knaus would set up a race car on the loose end and Jimmie Johnson would wheel that thing. Unfortunately, with this brand new, shiny, next generation car, you can't do that. When a race car driver tends to drive on that right rear, the car tends to spin out. Which is why when Jimmie Johnson does make a start, he tends to have a lot of single car spins, whether it's in practice, qualifying, or even on Sunday during the race. Driving the next gen car requires you to be versatile as a driver. That is hard for Jimmie Johnson, who thrived in the high horsepower, low downforce era, which is possibly another explanation as to why Jimmie Johnson struggled towards the back half of his Cup Series career. And it doesn't help that the NASCAR Cup Series is perhaps the most competitive it's ever been. Kevin Harvick a couple months ago came out and said that if he were to return to Cup in any capacity, he would be lucky to run 30th. Ironically, 6 months later, Kevin Harvick is going to be practicing and qualifying Jimmie Johnson's old ride. I wonder if Jimmie Johnson underestimated how hard it would be to return to professional stock car racing. He probably saw firsthand Jeff Gordon adopt the Rick Hendrick diet and lifestyle, then miraculously come back in July of 2016 and do an admirable job subbing for Dale Earnhardt Jr. My strong belief is that was the luxury of the Gen 6 era. The next generation car is not like that, as it has forced even the best Cup Series drivers to change and adapt their driving styles. The perfect example here is Chase Elliott, as he went over a year without a win because of how he was driving the car. Once other drivers started understanding the next generation car, Chase Elliott could no longer drive it like the Gen 6 and get Gen 6 results. To me, that is the biggest reason as to why Jimmie Johnson is struggling in modern NASCAR. Let's also not forget that the Legacy Motor Club, they're still developing as an organization, putting all the pieces together. Jimmie Johnson has talked about how there's a 5-year plan to make them contenders, so it's expected that there are some growing pains and Jimmie Johnson is towards the back. Although at Kansas, Jimmie Johnson showed potential. He qualified really well and he did okay in the race before he got in a wreck. So So the question is, what's going to make Jimmie Johnson be a lot more like a top NASCAR driver and a lot less like a washed up athlete? Is it more naps in front of the TV? Is it testosterone boosters? Is it the fact that he's not taking his medications on time? This is probably going to stun people, but if Jimmie Johnson wants to adapt to modern NASCAR, he should consider returning as a full-time driver. Okay, sure, the days of Jimmie hammering that final nail into the coffin of the Chase Contenders title hopes are over. However, being a full-time driver and racing every single week is the most efficient way to learn and perform with this car. Jimmie Johnson can learn what the next-gen car does with every single track, and every single race is gonna teach him something different. Am I turning the steering wheel enough? How close can I get to a driver to where I can actually make a clean pass? Or perhaps Jimmy's at COTA and he finds out those bumps are making his dentures hurt a little bit too much, so maybe he needs a mouth guard. If Jimmie Johnson commits to a full-time schedule, he's gonna go back to these tracks for a second time and use what he applied in that return trip. Plus, I believe a lot of people would like the idea of Jimmie Johnson making a return to a full-time schedule. Many tracks would get attendance boosts because Jimmie Johnson, a 7-time champion, is coming to their racetrack. It would also be an opportunity to try to rewrite the end of Jimmie Johnson's career. Some might say the charter situation is going to be complicated, but Legacy Motor Club is already looking to buy a new charter. Jimmie Johnson's honestly a Just for Men or AARP sponsorship away from having enough money to run the full schedule. Okay, I get it. It's a bit bold for a minimum wage worker to be clowning on a 7-time champion for being old. However, on a serious note, this might just be another case of Jimmie Johnson getting old. Like I said, it happens to even the best athletes, and possibly Jimmie Johnson might be in that state of denial. Look at the end of 2020. Jimmie Johnson missed the playoffs, didn't win a race, and in those last 10 races, he was completely irrelevant outside of his quote-unquote last race where he got a top 5 finish. Maybe he sees the end of his career like that one meme where somebody's mining and they give up a bit too soon. Because just look at what happened in 2021. Kyle Larson in that same car with Cliff Daniels as the crew chief won 10 races as well as the season championship. Potentially, Jimmie Johnson feels like Rusty Wallace, a driver that feels like he had a little bit left in the tank but stepped away too soon. And now Jimmie Johnson is in this battle between his head and his heart. His heart still has that passion to go out there and win races and be the best competitor that he can be. However, his head is telling him that he is unfortunately starting to age. That's not to say Jimmie Johnson can't make a comeback. Albert Pujols in 2022 had a resurgence year with the St. Louis Cardinals. Maybe Jimmie Johnson really does have a little bit left in the tank. However, in order to do so, he has a tall order to not only adapt to modern NASCAR, but do it as his abilities and his physical strength is starting to decline. That one's a little bit of a dark ending, but there's more positive videos here on Fuel Cell Full, like Michael McDowell going to Spire Motorsports. Meanwhile, if you want to watch more historical NASCAR content, please go check out my original channel, NRF Productions. Other than that, this is Nathan for Digital Gas House. Life's a beach, and then you drive.